Imagine a man who always believed he could charm his way through life, suddenly confronted with the silence of the woman he thought he controlled. That silence isn't empty. It is a mirror reflecting the darkness he never wanted to see. What is it that terrifies him more than rejection or conflict? It is the awakening of a truth he cannot manipulate, the fear of himself, stripped bare, with no mask to hide behind. Pause and consider. How often do we underestimate the power of calm dignity, the kind that exposes the cracks in even the most confident facade? Hold that thought as we explore what truly haunts a narcissistic man after he realizes the damage he has done. When a narcissistic man has hurt a genuinely good woman, the first fear that emerges is the confrontation with his own inner void, a space he has long avoided, denied, or masked. For years, he has projected a crafted image of power, charm, and control, building a world where his value appears externally validated and unassailable. Yet beneath this facade lies an emptiness, a lack of authentic connection, a hollow core where true selfhood should reside. The good woman, by refusing to remain trapped in his manipulations, acts as a mirror that reflects this inner emptiness back at him, unfiltered and undeniable. It is not her condemnation that terrifies him, but the silent acknowledgement of what he lacks: integrity, empathy, and the capacity for genuine intimacy. This confrontation cannot be bargained with or ignored. It exists independently of his will, revealing vulnerabilities he has spent a lifetime concealing. The void becomes more pronounced when he realizes that no charm, no flattery, and no manipulation can restore what he has disrupted or replace the authenticity he never cultivated. In facing this emptiness, he experiences a type of existential discomfort, a gnawing awareness that the foundations of his identity are fragile, that the sense of self he has relied upon is not fully real, but an elaborate performance. The good woman's integrity forces him to reckon with the truth he has long evaded, that behind every act of manipulation is a lack, a void, a shadow of selfhood he refuses to embrace. Her departure or detachment doesn't merely punish, it illuminates, leaving him to confront a reflection of his own soul, stripped of artifice, a reflection that cannot be silenced or dismissed, a confrontation he has always feared but can no longer avoid. After hurting a good woman, the narcissistic man experiences a profound and unsettling fear: the loss of control. Control has always been his primary currency in relationships, a mechanism through which he shapes reality to suit his needs, manipulates perception, and asserts dominance. In the presence of a good woman who refuses to comply with his emotional games or submit to his manipulations, he encounters a force that cannot be bent or coerced. She acts with autonomy, guided by her own values, boundaries, and self-respect. And in doing so, she shatters the familiar structure upon which his identity has been built. The terror lies not in her actions alone, but in what they signify: a world that cannot be controlled, a reflection of life moving independently of his will. Unlike temporary defiance or conflict, this is a permanent assertion of sovereignty that exposes his impotence, revealing that his influence is neither absolute nor eternal. He becomes acutely aware that the strategies he has relied upon, charm, guilt, intimidation, or subtle coercion, no longer guarantee outcomes. The loss of control forces him to confront a truth long buried, that he has been constructing a reality as much in denial of his own weaknesses as in domination of others. It ignites anxiety, frustration, and a sense of vulnerability because his ego is threatened by the very possibility that the good woman can exist, act, and flourish outside of his sphere of influence. This fear is deeply psychological, not merely practical. It is the destabilization of the internal architecture of power he has spent a lifetime cultivating. In essence, The good woman's independence and unwavering self-possession illuminate the fragility of his control, leaving him to grapple with a sense of impotence he cannot negotiate, manipulate, or suppress. One of the deepest fears a narcissistic man experiences after hurting a good woman is the reality of irreversible rejection. Unlike fleeting anger, temporary withdrawal, or reactive distancing, this type of rejection is grounded in self-respect and conscious disengagement. It is a refusal to tolerate further manipulation, a boundary that cannot be negotiated or circumvented. For a man whose identity is intricately bound to control and validation, the permanence of such rejection is devastating. It is not merely that he has lost her attention or affection, it is that he has been confronted with the undeniable truth that his influence has limits. The permanence of her departure signals that the tools he has relied upon, charm, persuasion, and subtle coercion, are no longer sufficient, and this revelation strikes at the core of his self-concept. In the shadowed spaces of his psyche, he experiences an existential alarm. The knowledge that some wounds cannot be erased, that some trust cannot be reconstructed once it is broken. This rejection acts as a mirror, reflecting his incapacity for genuine intimacy and his inability to honor the intrinsic value of another human being. Unlike other relationships where he can restart, reset, or manipulate outcomes, the encounter with a good woman who refuses to be diminished is final. It introduces him to the terrifying possibility that actions have consequences he cannot evade, that moral and emotional reality exists beyond the reach of his ego's illusions. In this confrontation, he glimpses a world in which respect, integrity, and self-worth are not subject to negotiation, and he faces the shattering realization that some losses are permanent, a truth he cannot control, influence, or reverse. After hurting a genuinely good woman, the narcissistic man is confronted with a fear that he rarely acknowledges: moral reflection. For much of his life, he has operated within a framework of self-justification, rationalization, and external validation, carefully avoiding the gaze of conscience or the scrutiny of ethical truth. Yet when his actions harm someone whose integrity and authenticity cannot be manipulated, he faces a mirror that reflects not just her pain, but the ethical void within himself. This reflection is uncomfortable, unsettling, and unavoidable. It forces him to reckon with the consequences of his behavior beyond superficial outcomes or appearances. In the quiet space left by her disengagement, he is haunted by questions he cannot silence. Did I act fairly? Did I honor her humanity? Was I cruel, not just strategically, but intrinsically? These inquiries stir a shadow he has long denied, the part of the psyche that recognizes wrongdoing, even when it serves no practical purpose to admit it. Unlike ordinary guilt that can be minimized, diverted, or spun into justification, the moral reflection provoked by a good woman is persistent and revealing. It exposes a dissonance between the self he portrays and the self he has allowed to act without conscience. This confrontation can feel threatening because it undermines the narratives he has built to preserve his ego's illusion of superiority. In essence, moral reflection is a form of inner reckoning that cannot be negotiated. It illuminates the ethical fissures in his character and demands awareness of his responsibility. It is a fear rooted not in external punishment, but in the silent, unrelenting judgment of one's own psyche, a judgment that he cannot evade, charm, or control. The experience is disquieting because it points to a truth he has long resisted, that his actions have ethical weight and that some consequences are unavoidable, regardless of manipulation or denial. One of the most destabilizing fears for a narcissistic man after harming a genuinely good woman is the loss of his carefully constructed, idealized self-image. For years, he has relied on the perception of others to affirm his identity, cultivating a persona of charm, competence, and indispensability. This image is not merely a mask. It is the very foundation upon which he navigates the world, a fragile architecture of ego built on admiration and compliance. When a good woman refuses to be manipulated, when she sees through his illusions and disengages, the very pillars of this identity tremble. He experiences the terrifying realization that the person he has presented to the world, someone heroic, lovable, or indispensable, may be a facade, visible only to those willing to overlook the truth. Her insight and detachment act as a mirror, reflecting not the image he projects but the reality he has long avoided confronting, the emptiness, insecurity, and moral deficiencies that lie beneath. This confrontation shatters the illusion of invulnerability and control, revealing a self that is flawed, human, and fallible. The loss of the idealized self-image is profoundly threatening because it is not simply about external perception. It undermines the internal narrative he has relied upon to justify his choices and sustain his ego. He is forced to recognize that admiration cannot compensate for authenticity and that the masks he wears are fragile, subject to exposure by those whose integrity cannot be compromised. In facing this loss, he experiences disorientation, fear, and a deep sense of vulnerability as the persona he has depended upon to navigate life no longer shields him from the awareness of his true self. The good woman's refusal to participate in the illusion becomes a catalyst, revealing not only his emptiness but also the existential necessity of confronting the self he has long denied. After harming a good woman, one of the most profound fears a narcissistic man experiences is the exposure of his weakness. For much of his life, he has carefully constructed an image of invulnerability, a persona that masks insecurity, self-doubt, and emotional fragility. He thrives on the perception of strength, superiority, and control, and his interactions are often designed to conceal the very vulnerabilities he fears to acknowledge. When confronted with a good woman who will not tolerate his manipulations or participate in his games, these vulnerabilities are revealed in ways he cannot manipulate or dismiss. Her autonomy and unwavering integrity act as a lens, highlighting the areas of his psyche that are fragile, insecure, and dependent on external validation. This exposure is not merely social or superficial, it penetrates deep into his sense of self, forcing him to confront qualities he has long denied, repressed, or hidden. Unlike minor slights or criticism, which he can deflect, charm away, or spin into justification, the exposure brought about by a good woman is irrefutable. It reveals the dissonance between the persona he presents and the reality of his inner experience. He fears being seen as fallible, helpless, or emotionally dependent because these qualities threaten the very foundation of his ego. In this confrontation, the facade of strength collapses, leaving him vulnerable to both internal reflection and the silent acknowledgement of his own limitations. The exposure of weakness forces him to reckon with the human condition he has long refused to accept. That imperfection, vulnerability, and moral accountability are inescapable aspects of existence. In essence, the fear is not simply of judgment from others, but of the undeniable awareness of his own fragility, a truth that he cannot negotiate, charm, or manipulate away, and a realization that the good woman's presence has illuminated parts of himself that he has spent a lifetime concealing. After harming a good woman, a narcissistic man is confronted with a subtle yet profound fear: the impact of his actions on his legacy. For much of his life, he has relied on perception and narrative control to shape how others see him, cultivating admiration, influence, and a reputation that reinforces his sense of importance. Yet when a woman of integrity is hurt by him, he realizes that her perception, grounded in truth rather than flattery or manipulation, cannot be erased or rewritten. She embodies a living testament to his actions, a witness whose judgment is informed not by fear or obligation, but by clarity, dignity, and self-respect. This realization strikes deeply because it challenges his ability to control the narrative of who he is, both in the present and in memory. Unlike superficial criticism, which can be spun or silenced, the moral and emotional witness of a good woman carries weight and endurance. Her story, her recollection, and her influence cannot be easily diminished, and he fears that the harm he has caused may define him in ways that admiration, charm, or manipulation cannot repair. The fear of legacy impact is existential. It forces him to reckon with the permanence of actions in a moral and social sense. It is not simply about reputation, it is about the recognition that some truths endure beyond ego defenses, spin, or superficial reconciliation. In this way, her departure or disengagement acts as a mirror reflecting the consequences of his choices, revealing the disconnect between the self-image he has crafted and the reality that others, especially those whose character he cannot bend, will perceive. The weight of this realization, of being remembered not as the charming, omnipotent figure he desires, but as someone capable of harm, awakens anxiety, shame, and the rare confrontation with ethical accountability. It is a fear rooted in the inevitability of truth, the permanence of actions, and the recognition that legacy is shaped not by ego, but by the lives one touches and the respect one forfeits. The ultimate fear that haunts a narcissistic man after hurting a good woman is existential loneliness, a profound isolation that no charm, manipulation, or external validation can dispel. For much of his life, he has surrounded himself with people who reinforce his ego, who admire, fear, or depend on him, creating the illusion of connection and significance. Yet when a good woman, embodying integrity, self-respect, and authenticity, disengages from his influence, he confronts a solitude that is stark, inescapable, and deeply unsettling. This loneliness is not merely physical or social, it is existential, reflecting the internal emptiness he has long denied. It forces him to face the reality of a self that exists independently of applause, manipulation, or the projection of an idealized image. In the presence of such absence, the masks he has relied upon, charm, control, dominance, fall away, revealing the raw, unadorned truth of his psyche. The quiet left by her departure is filled with reflection, doubt, and awareness of the parts of himself he has never acknowledged, fear, inadequacy, and moral deficiency. Unlike temporary isolation, this experience cannot be soothed by superficial distractions. It is the confrontation with a core of being that is vulnerable, incomplete, and human. Existential loneliness illuminates the gap between the persona he presents and the authentic self he has long avoided. It reveals that his power, influence, and manipulation cannot substitute for genuine connection, and it forces recognition of the consequences of his choices. In facing this profound solitude, he is reminded of a truth that cannot be negotiated or manipulated. Intimacy, respect, and emotional reciprocity are not commodities, and the absence of those who embody these qualities exposes the emptiness that lies at the heart of a narcissistic existence. This fear, more than any external judgment, threatens the very foundation of his identity and leaves him to confront the silent, unyielding reality of himself. In the end, what a narcissistic man fears most after hurting a good woman is not her anger, not her words, and not even her departure in isolation. It is the awakening of truths he has long denied, the confrontation with the void within, the collapse of control, and the permanence of rejection that cannot be bargained with. It is the moral reflection that exposes the shadow of his choices, the loss of the idealized self-image he has so carefully constructed, and the revelation of weakness he has spent a lifetime concealing. It is the realization that his actions leave a legacy beyond manipulation, a truth that others, especially those of integrity, will remember. And above all, it is the existential loneliness, the silent reckoning with a self that cannot be adorned, controlled, or admired into existence. A good woman, in her dignity, patience, and unwavering authenticity, becomes a mirror reflecting the man's unacknowledged emptiness and shadow. She illuminates the chasms within his psyche, forcing him to confront aspects of himself he has long avoided: vulnerability, imperfection, and moral accountability. Her departure is not a punishment. It is a revelation, a quiet force that awakens fear not because it threatens her, but because it forces him to face what he has been hiding from all along. In that confrontation lies the essence of his terror, the awareness that no facade can shield him from the consequences of his own choices, and no charm can fill the emptiness that has been revealed. And it is here, in the unflinching light of integrity and self-respect, that the narcissistic man encounters what he fears most: a truth that is immutable, undeniable, and entirely beyond his control.